Hello and welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eun Cho. The United States continues to send signals it is ready to resume negotiations with North Korea. But North Korea has yet to express its willingness to return. What is North Korea's strategy after receiving U.S. proposals at the Stockholm talks?
Overpowering U.S. force truly will have their security interests, and they can successfully trade this nuclear program, which frankly makes them less secure.
경의하는 최고령도자 김정은 동지께서 백두산정의 어르시였습니다.
In the studio with me today, Mr. Thomas Countryman, Board Chairman of the Arms Control Association. Mr. Countryman was acting Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security. Also joining me, Mr. Richard Johnson, Senior Director for Fuel Cycle and Verification at the Nuclear Threat Initiative. Mr. Johnson served as the Director for Non-Proliferation at the National Security Council. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Now, Mr. Countryman, the North Korean negotiators returned to Pyongyang after receiving U.S. proposals in Stockholm. What follow-up measures do you expect in Pyongyang?
Well, of course, it's impossible to know exactly the internal dynamics in Pyongyang and the consideration of the North Koreans for their next step. I think that they were disappointed in what the United States put on the table. Their negotiating team did not have the flexibility in their instructions that would allow them to make a good counteroffer to the United States. And so now I think the North Koreans face a choice between returning to the negotiations or going back to a series of provocative tests of long-range missiles and possibly nuclear weapons.
And many experts say that North Korea would not cross President Trump's red line of nuclear experiment or ICBM. So why do you think otherwise?
I think that the North Koreans have been giving signals, including the visit of Chairman Kim to Mount Petku, that indicate he wants to take some dramatic step. And his capability to take a dramatic step that would galvanize his own support is stronger in the field of testing than it is in the field of negotiation. He's got more control there.
And Mr. Johnson, what other considerations are there for North Korea, like U.S. domestic politics?
I think what's going on in Washington right now is definitely going through the minds of Kim Jong-un and all of his negotiating team. If you recall, during the Hanoi summit, we were just going through the testimony of Michael Cohen, the president's former assistant and lawyer, and I think they were very much attuned to what was going on Capitol Hill. So this is the unfortunate element of summit diplomacy. I think it was a good idea for President Trump to meet with Kim Jong-un because both systems are now essentially top-driven in many ways. However, I think now the North Koreans may be thinking if they're not getting the answers that they want at the working level negotiations, they'll just try again at the top level with President Trump.
We do not know what were exactly proposed in Stockholm, but what do you think were in the minds of North Korean and U.S. negotiators?
I think it's fascinating that the first person to speak after the Stockholm talks was the North Korean negotiator Kim Myung-gil, who has a lot of experience working with the media, having previously been in their mission in New York. And I think he came out to put a very strong message down that they were very disappointed, their expectations were high, and if you listen to what he said, he basically said, we're not prepared to give up our nuclear deterrent with no promise of future security for North Korea. So they seemed very focused on security assurances. This is a change from Singapore and Hanoi, where they talked a lot about sanctions relief. I think at the end of the day, the issue still hasn't changed that much. North Korea wants to be compensated for what they think that they did as a gift to the United States by suspending nuclear tests and ICBM tests. They don't think that they were rewarded for that. And they also feel that they need more assurances of the future of their system. And right now, apparently, the US is still focused in on much shorter term measures and trying to define an end state, which I think is going to be hard to do if you haven't even begun to have a negotiation.
And Mr. Countryman, North Koreans were upset that United States didn't bring new calculation. So other than the security guarantee that Mr. Johnson just mentioned, what do you think were the other factors that North Koreans were upset about?
Well, the North Koreans have a tendency to be upset about many different things simultaneously and then to make a public show of it. It's part of their negotiating strategy. And I don't discount one thing that Richard mentioned before the program, that they were upset that it was the U.S. that walked out of the Hanoi meeting, and in a way this was a measure of revenge for them to be the ones who walk out of a difficult meeting. I think in substantive terms, their disappointment was probably that in their view, the U.S. proposal did not move significantly beyond what was proposed in Hanoi. In other words, what the U.S. asked for in Hanoi was complete denuclearization in return for some sanctions lifting. In Stockholm this month, it was complete denuclearization in return for more sanctions lifting, but not complete sanctions lifting. And I understand why the North Koreans may see that as being only a marginal improvement over the previous United States position.
And adding to what Mr. Countryman just said, according to Japanese media, what U.S. proposed was a temporary suspension of ban on textile and coal exports from North Korea in return for dismantlement of Yongbyon and stopping the uranium enrichment. So do you think this is the kind of idea that is being in the minds of U.S. negotiators? Because we're seeing repeated reports on the similar proposals.
Right. I mean, we don't know for certain what was proposed at all at the table. But I mean, if these reports are accurate, I see one positive glimmer of hope, which is that perhaps the United States is moving away from this concept of no sanctions relief before complete denuclearization. I think that's a complete non-starter. The North Koreans will clearly need to see parallel steps on the things that they're interested in exchange for certain nuclear actions. So the concept that was reported in the Japanese media is actually a good one. Shutting down fissile material production, that's the highly enriched uranium and plutonium that feeds these bombs. I would say add verification to that element, get the International Atomic Energy Agency in there quickly to verify that this activity has ceased and what they've actually been doing in recent years. And then in exchange, provide some sort of limited sanctions relief. The report talked about maybe it'd be time limited as well, maybe 36 months or so. My recommendation would be to also make sure that you could easily reimpose those sanctions. In the Iran nuclear deal that I also worked on, we came up with a concept called snapback, which meant that you could easily reimpose sanctions without China or Russia vetoing them if, in that case, Iran violated its commitments for nuclear disarmament, or they didn't have nuclear arms, but their nuclear activities were ceasing. If you don't do that with North Korea, there's no way of confirming that they won't continue to do clandestine activities and still receive the benefits of sanctions relief.
What do you think of the snapback measures? Because some are concerned that you cannot fully restore the power of sanctions as before.
I think Richard has a good point about one of the strengths of the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA. The North Korean situation is somewhat different because some of the most damaging sanctions to the North Korean economy are those imposed unilaterally by the United States, not by the United Nations Security Council. So I would focus, if I were asked, on the U.S. unilateral sanctions that can be easily reimposed. Coal and textiles are part of the United Nations package as well. And so if there were a sufficient move by the North Koreans to justify easing of those sanctions, perhaps with a snapback provision, that would be a smart thing to do.
And Chairman Kim Jong-un went to Mount Paektu, the sacred mountain, on a white horse. And his aides are convinced that he is up to a grand operations. So what was the message there?
I'm certain that his aides were commanded to be convinced that he is up to some great operation. But it is a public relations spectacle, complete with a beautiful white horse, that is meant to demonstrate his strength, his decisiveness, all the things that he believes are important for his image with the North Korean people. What's the message for the rest of the world? I honestly don't know. I think it is a reminder from the North Koreans to the Americans that they have other options besides another round of negotiations.
I also think we should think about the fact that there are domestic politics in North Korea. We don't know very much about them, but I think that there was a real loss of face for Kim Jong-un after Hanoi. There were very high expectations that he was going to get a big deal for North Korea from Donald Trump. And the failure of those talks in Hanoi may have had a negative impact on his standing with the Korean People's Army, with other parts of the military and the army, and also with the party. And so North Korea is now going through a moment where internally there is a consideration about what should we do next. So I think Kim Jong-un is also trying to bolster his own standing within his own system. Even though he is a supreme leader, he still has to balance different factors within his government. So seeing him on a white horse up at Paektusan does send a certain image.
So at this point, Mr. Countryman, how much denuclearization action do you think North Korea is ready to take?
I think very little, to be honest. They will be willing, if compensated in the way they think is right, to take limited steps that would stop fissile material production and perhaps allow the return of International Atomic Energy Agency inspectors. But I think Richard made the point earlier that you cannot, at this moment, achieve what the United States is demanding, which is to define right now what complete denuclearization would look like. You can get to that point after a couple of years of serious negotiations on smaller steps. And I hope that both sides will focus on that. But I don't see a prospect that at the next negotiating round, the North Koreans will suddenly say, okay, we are prepared to give up all weapons.
And how can the two sides find middle ground?
Well, I think both sides need to take another look at what their goals are for this negotiation. As Tom said, I think right now there's a little bit too much focus on the U.S. side of defining the end state for North Korea, which is complete denuclearization, no biological or chemical weapons, and no long-range ballistic missiles. It's very hard to do that. There's too much mistrust and too much negative history between the DPRK and the United States. But what I would do is I would begin to start with an initial step. And I hate to keep making reference to the Iran nuclear deal, but people forget that the JCPOA was not the first step in the Iran nuclear deal. There was something called the JPOA, the Joint Plan of Action, that froze Iran's nuclear activities and provided limited sanctions relief for Iran. If I were advising the U.S. team, I would say, do the same thing with North Korea. Freeze production at Yongbyon, maybe you can get at additional sites, limited reversible sanctions relief, and the return of the IAEA. For the North Koreans, I think they have to be a little bit more realistic. Now, what I would add is I think a new element needs to be added to these talks. And this is something that our organization, the Nuclear Threat Initiative, has put forward, which is the idea of a cooperative threat reduction plan. That is to work together with North Korea, the United States, South Korea, and other countries to actually assist them, not only in taking apart their nuclear program, but in converting their program for civil use and for commercial activities. If we can reassure North Korea that we want to work with them moving forward to modernize their economy, that might be able to get at some of those concerns.
Now, before we go, Mr. Countryman, both you and Mr. Johnson say that United States shouldn't go for complete denuclearization. But then former U.S. negotiator, Ambassador Joe DeTrani, says if there's any wavering on the need for complete denuclearization, then North Korea may think that it can keep some of its nuclear weapons and facilities. So what is your pushback to that idea?
I certainly didn't mean to say that complete denuclearization should not be the goal. It should be the goal, and we should restate it, and we should restate constantly that there can be no completely normal U.S.-North Korean relationship without complete denuclearization. But to seek to jump all the way from 0 to 100 in one leap is not realistic. You can make a number of intermediate goals that would reduce the danger that North Korea poses, that would give reassurance to both sides about goodwill, and that moves you gradually to the goal, which is an important one that we should stick to.
Well, we'll have to leave it there and now watch video for our next discussion.
What we're seeing from China right now, unfortunately, is some slippage in the enforcement of the sanctions.
Russia and China are considered to continue with their sanctions-busting activities. How can the international community maintain maximum sanctions pressure on North Korea? Now, Mr. Countryman, Assistant Secretary Shriver pointed out that there is some slippage on China's sanctions enforcement, especially ship-to-ship transfers. So what do you make of China's sanctions enforcement?
China did not have a high priority on strategic trade control or export control during the time that I served in government. And it was the most constant topic of conversation between me and my Chinese counterpart from 2011 to 2016. They have gradually improved their ability to control their exports, but it is not at the level that it should be, considering China's important role in global trade. I think that there is both this deficiency in their capacity as well as a political decision that enforcing these controls on North Korea is simply not high enough priority for China. And remember that more than 90% of North Korean imports and exports go through China. So the Chinese absolutely have a central role in enforcing the sanctions which they voted for at the UN Security Council, and they need to do better if we're going to move forward in this process.
Mm-hmm. And Mr. Johnson, Washington Post reports that Russia is sending North Korean laborers to its neighboring country of Abkhazia. And what does Russia stand to gain from doing this?
Well, Russia was gaining a lot previously from North Korean workers coming into their Far East. I was actually recently, about a year ago, in Vladivostok, which is, of course, the main Russian port city right on the border near North Korea. And it was fascinating that people had noticed that there was a huge drop in the number of North Koreans that were actually living and working in Vladivostok. People couldn't hire folks to help them with household reconstruction and actual major projects that were happening. So I think that the Russians saw a way to get the benefit of having North Korean workers by redirecting them to this territory where it's unclear who actually has control right now. We should be clear. These are UN Security Council resolution violations on the part of Russia and North Korea. Abkhazia is really probably should be controlled by Georgia. This is a disputed territory, but unfortunately for Georgia, they don't have any actual ability to enforce the sanctions from this perspective. So I think Russia is doing what it always does. It's looking into their own best interests. They're trying to get economic benefit while also trying to be able to say that they're not violating the UN sanctions, when in fact, I think that they are.
Mm-hmm. And Mr. Countryman, former ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, was very vocal about Russia's infringement of sanctions. So is it a better idea to call out on Russia and China publicly or seek ways closed doors?
Well, if you don't have any real dialogue with somebody, then all you have left is public statements. And the fact is, we don't have a meaningful bilateral dialogue with Russia right now for a number of reasons. With China, we don't have a dialogue at the level and of the quality that we should have. Again, during the Obama administration, we spoke constantly to the Chinese about improving their export enforcement capabilities. And because they were making progress, not sufficient, not fast enough, but progress, we did not call them out publicly as well. There has to be a combination of both, but if you're not actually talking with credibility to those partners, then simply criticizing them in public is not going to be sufficient.
And Mr. Johnson, many people say that ever since the Singapore summit, the maximum pressure has weakened. Then why does North Korea want to ease sanctions on its country so badly?
Well, sanctions are still having a very strong impact on North Korea. I mean, the reality is if Kim Jong-un wants to achieve his goal of opening up to the world in terms of economy, not so much on the political side, he's going to have access to international financial markets, international capital, and to trade with countries other than China and Russia. As Tom Countryman pointed out, about 90% of its trade right now is with China. And though we often think of China as being North Korea's friend, and you hear so much about the old saying that they were like lips and teeth, in fact, I think North Korea views China as a possible enemy as well. They don't trust the Chinese that much. They would like to have more options in the world, certainly with South Korea, but perhaps with others, including the United States. That's not possible under the current sanctions regime. So I think it's true that North Korea has found a way, particularly for its elites, to survive under very strong sanctions pressure. This has been the case in other countries around the world too. But to actually achieve real progress in economic development, these sanctions have to go away.
Now, Mr. Countryman, there are criticism that sanctions on North Korea are not sectoral nor targeted but comprehensive, just like UN's sanctions on Haiti and Iraq, and that it is affecting everyday North Koreans. So what is your take on that?
Whenever the international community has used sanctions as a tool to change reprehensible behavior, autocratic regimes, whether they were Iraq, or Serbia, or Iran, or North Korea, or Russia, have made sure that the elites in their system do not suffer and that the burden is borne by the lowest economic classes in society. This is what North Korea is doing today. So the fault for the widespread humanitarian suffering of the North Korean people does not rest primarily with sanctions. It rests directly with the economic and political policies of the regime. That said, the United States should do better than it has recently in allowing humanitarian exceptions both to its own sanctions and to United Nations sanctions in order to mitigate the harsh effect of sanctions. There should be more routine approval given when humanitarian organizations seek exceptions from the UN Security Council for delivery of medicine and food. And we're not seeing that kind of skillful, creative thinking when it comes to enforcement of sanctions.
Well, we'll have to end our conversation here and now move on to our next segment. Now time for the photo moment, time to look at an interesting North Korea picture. Today we have a photo of a World Cup soccer qualifier between North and South Korea held in Pyongyang. The game ended in 0-0 draw, with players having rough physical encounters. The South Korean side said North Koreans used everything from elbows to hands to knees and that it was like a war. North Korean government also didn't allow media coverage and spectators. Mr. Johnson?
Well, I think this is a sign that inter-Korean relations have dropped to a low level once again. Earlier, during the Pyeongchang Olympics, if you compare these two photos, the photo of Moon Jae-in standing next to Kim Yo-jong in the stadium in Pyeongchang versus this photo, that's only been a year and a half. What a dramatic change in inter-Korean relations. Right now, I think in some ways the North Koreans are more angry with Moon Jae-in than they are with Donald Trump.
It looks like there were plenty of seats available. I would have gone if I'd known about it. The interesting thing to me is that they didn't allow spectators. Nobody in the world is better at managing and controlling mass crowds than the North Korean regime. And if they were unwilling to have a few tens of thousands North Koreans attending this, I wonder if it is a comment on their ability or their confidence in their ability to control crowds.
Well, on that note, this is all the time we have for this week. Mr. Johnson,
Thank you.
Mr. Countryman, thank you for joining
Thank
us.
you.
Now, this was Washington Talk from the Voice of America, and I'm Eun-jung Cho. Join us next week for more analysis on North Korea.